What if the memory that haunts you isn't a memory at all, but a scar from another version of your life? You're driving late at night. The highway is slick, your headlights cutting through the dark. A pair of lights drifts into your lane, too close, too fast. You swerve, heart pounding, and somehow you miss. You pull over, shaking, alive. You tell the story later, maybe laugh a little, call it luck. But deep down, something doesn't feel right. It never has. Moments like these linger. The fall you should have never walked away from. The chest pain that vanished. The bullet that didn't hit. The miracle that no one can explain. You survived. But the numbers say you shouldn't have. Here's the unsettling proposition. You didn't. In the strict mathematics of probability, fatal events are bound to happen. The chance of surviving every moment in a human lifespan is statistically microscopic. And yet you're here, reading this, remembering the escape, not the impact. Because somewhere, just as real as here, you didn't survive. This is the first proof, the crack in the glass, the invisible seam in reality. The concept is known to physicists as the many worlds interpretation. Every possible outcome of every event creates a new branch of the universe. A fork in the road, splitting endlessly. One version of you died on that highway. Another went on breathing. Guess which one you are. Now layer this idea onto consciousness, your awareness, your sense of I. If death ends consciousness, and consciousness can't perceive non-existence, then your awareness simply continues in the branches where you remain alive. You never witness your own end. You only ever jump to the version of the world where you don't die. You are not the version that survived by chance. You are the version that was required to survive in order to keep observing. Your stream of consciousness selects the surviving branch by default. The filter is biological. The sorting is invisible. And every miracle you remember is, in reality, a tombstone for the version of you that didn't make it. This isn't meant to frighten you. It's meant to reframe you. Your continued presence in this world is not a statistical oddity. It's a systemic feature of how reality may be structured. Every near-death experience you carry is a silent echo of another timeline, a version of you gone, leaving only the observer intact. So look back. Remember those impossible moments, the brush with death, the inexplicable turn of luck, the impossible diagnosis reversed. These aren't just stories, they're seams in the simulation, proof that your presence here is not the whole story. And the deeper question, the one that sets our journey in motion, is not, why am I still alive? It's, what did I leave behind to be here? It began with a flicker, a moment where something didn't match, a logo you remember differently, a line from a movie that sounds wrong. You pause, you frown, you wonder if you're just remembering it wrong. Everyone does, right? But then someone else says it too. And someone else. Thousands of people across the world remembering the same thing the same wrong way. The fruit of the Loom logo had a cornucopia. Sinbad starred in a movie called Shazam. Nelson Mandela died in prison. Except none of that ever happened. This phenomenon has been given a name: the Mandela Effect. Conventional science attributes it to faulty memory, to the malleability of the human mind, to the influence of suggestion and social pressure. It's all explainable, they say. Nothing to see here. But what if there's more to it? What if these shared misrememberings are more than cognitive quirks? What if they are data corruption from a transfer of you? Imagine this. Your consciousness is like a file, and this world is a server. When your original body dies in timeline A, your awareness doesn't just end. It uploads seamlessly into the next viable reality, Timeline B, a nearly identical copy. Same people, same home, same history, almost, but not quite. A different font in a childhood cereal box. A politician's fate rewritten. A movie that never existed. These aren't big enough to crash your brain's continuity. They're just glitches, artifacts left behind when your memory cache doesn't quite match the new environment. And you feel it. That subtle, disturbing click in your mind when something doesn't line up. You're not wrong. You're remembering another version of Earth. That strange certainty you carry, the sense that your recollection is real even when the world disagrees, is not arrogance. It's residue, leftovers from a previous life that no longer exists. Skeptics ask, if timeline shifts are real, why are the differences so minor? But that's exactly the point. You can only transition to a timeline close enough to preserve your sanity, your biology, your history. A world where gravity pulls upward wouldn't work. A world where your best friend never existed would break you. So the system only moves you sideways. Not far, just enough to keep you breathing. And the result? A lifetime of small, haunting inconsistencies, like scratches on an old record. They don't stop the music, but they remind you something happened. What you remember isn't an error. It's a footprint. The Mandela Effect isn't a mystery about the past. It's a breadcrumb from the moment your path diverged. It's not about how reality fooled your memory. It's about how memory refused to be overwritten. And in that stubborn memory, there's a signal. You are not native to this timeline. You are a traveler, a survivor, a refugee from a version of the world that no longer includes you. And maybe, just maybe, you're not supposed to be here at all. We're taught to think of death as a singular moment, a heartbeat lost, a line gone flat. But death, in the quantum landscape, behaves more like a fork in the road than a destination. To grasp this, we return to the most bizarre corners of physics. The double-slit experiment. A particle is fired at a barrier with two openings. If no one watches, it behaves like a wave, passing through both slits at once, creating an interference pattern on the wall behind it. But if you place a detector to observe it, the wave collapses. The particle chooses one slit. It behaves like matter. The very act of observation alters the past behavior of the particle. That was strange enough. Then came the delayed choice quantum eraser, a setup so surreal, it seemed like a thought experiment, but it's been demonstrated. In this experiment, the decision to observe the particle can be made after it has already passed through the slits. And yet, this delayed observation still determines how the particle behaved. In other words, the future influences the past. Observation reshapes reality retroactively. Now expand this phenomenon. Scale it up from particles to people, to you. What if your consciousness is the observer? What if the universe must resolve itself around you in ways that maintain your continuity? What if reality is a story written around its narrator? This is the foundation of what some call the double-slit future bias. The idea that the universe is not a stage set and waiting. It is rendered dynamically, moment to moment, based on your continued presence as an observer. If your death would collapse the narrative, then the storyline adjusts. It curves around the obstacle. It rewrites itself to keep you alive. This might be why the falling glass didn't break, why the truck missed you by inches, why the doctor's grim certainty turned into a medical anomaly, not miracles, not divine will, just a system avoiding a crash. You are not cheating death. You are the node around which probability reshapes. As long as you observe, the universe must obey a singular rule. It must provide you with a version of reality in which you can continue to observe. If a timeline reaches a dead end, your dead end, it is discarded, like bad code. You shift seamlessly into the nearest viable branch, one in which you survive, no matter how unlikely. So the question isn't, did I almost die? It's how many times has the world bent around me just to keep me going? There's a reason the most common phrase after near-death is it all happened in slow motion. It wasn't just adrenaline, it was buffering, a system lag, reality calculating your escape route. And as we'll see next, the deeper you go into these moments, the stranger the symptoms become. You remember the moment clearly, not just the event, but the feeling. Time slowed. The world dulled like someone turned down the volume. You saw everything in vivid detail. The spinning wheel, the falling glass, the tilt of your body just before the impact that never came. And then you were safe. But something felt off afterward. Your ears rang. Your hands felt unfamiliar. The room seemed quieter than it should have. You blinked, touched your face, stood up, and it all felt just a little wrong. Clinical psychology calls this derealization, a dissociative symptom triggered by trauma or extreme stress, a way for the brain to protect itself. But that explanation, while convenient, doesn't quite touch the texture of the feeling, does it? Because it doesn't explain the hum, that low, vibrating sensation in your chest, the static in the air, the way light seemed different, or how your skin felt 1 degree out of sync with the room. It doesn't explain why, for a few seconds or sometimes hours, you felt like a ghost in your own life. Let's shift our lens. In quantum physics, when an electron changes energy levels, it emits or absorbs a photon, a transfer of energy, a leap from one orbit to another, a quantum jump. What if your consciousness does the same thing? When you're flung out of your dying body in one timeline and emerge in a living version of yourself in another, there has to be an energetic cost. Something has to carry the data across. Something has to bridge the frequencies of two nearly identical but not quite perfect biological hosts. That ringing in your ears, that weightlessness, that uncanny detachment from your surroundings, that's the resonance of the jump. You're syncing, you're recalibrating. Your consciousness is realigning with a new neural pattern, a new chemical profile, a slightly different body. It's not your first, and it won't be your last. This also explains a curious pattern reported by survivors of near-death experiences, subtle personality changes, new preferences, an abrupt disinterest in a lifelong passion, a sudden craving for a food you once hated. You think, the experience changed me. Maybe it did. Or maybe you're just not you anymore. Not exactly. You're a version close enough to convince others, but carrying different settings. A stranger wearing your name, answering to your memories, but wondering why their reflection looks unfamiliar today. We call this a merge conflict. Your mind is settling into a foreign system and adapting in real time. Some differences you dismiss, others haunt you. That strange sense of unreality you couldn't shake. That was the only real thing. It was your consciousness knocking on the door of a new reality, whispering, "You're not home anymore." Imagine a man sits in a sealed box. Inside that box is a single atom, radioactive, unpredictable. In the next minute, there's a 50% chance it will decay, triggering a mechanism that releases a gas. If it does, the man dies. If it doesn't, he lives. Outside the box, an observer would say, there's a coin flip's chance of survival. But from the perspective of the man inside, something else entirely unfolds. In the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, both outcomes happen. The universe splits. In one timeline, the atom decays. In another, it does not. In one, he dies. In the other, he breathes. But here's the twist. He never experiences the version where he dies. From his point of view, he always wakes up, always survives, again and again. Each time, he hears the click of survival, not the silence of death. This is the thought experiment of quantum suicide, an idea that pushes probability to its furthest edge and exposes a terrifying kind of immortality, not for the body, but for the mind trapped within its own unbroken stream of observation. Now pull this metaphor out of the box and into your life. Every day, you cross streets, eat food, fall asleep, get behind the wheel. Each moment is a trigger. Each second, the universe forks. A million possible deaths bloom and fall away like shadows behind glass. You dodge them not because of luck, but because your consciousness filters them out. You remain only in the slivers of time where you continue. The cost? You leave pieces of yourself behind. In the vast majority of timelines, you have already died. Your funeral has already been held. A version of you lies still in 1,000 variations of the world. Your friends mourn you. Your name fades, but not here. Not in this razor-thin strand of survival where you're still moving forward. And if you're honest, you felt it. The mounting improbability, the sense that things keep happening that shouldn't, that you are being pulled through a series of increasingly narrow escape routes, that the path ahead feels stretched, unnatural, like walking on the last thread of a fraying web. You are not lucky, you are condemned. Condemned to survive when you should not have, condemned to inhabit the one slice of reality that hasn't closed its doors behind you. The one version of the world still willing to carry your ghost. And as the timelines grow stranger, more distorted, more isolated, one truth becomes harder to ignore. You are not meant to still be here, but you are. And this story is not finished with you yet. The longer you live on borrowed time, the stranger the symptoms become. You might not notice at first. A subtle change in the sky's hue. A favorite restaurant with a menu you swear was different. A friend's story that doesn't match your memory. You shake your head, blame stress, blame forgetfulness. You move on. But the dissonance accumulates. It shows up in your dreams, places you've never been that feel achingly familiar. You wake up with tears in your eyes and no idea why. You stare at your own reflection and wonder when your face started looking like someone else's. Not older, not wrong, just unfamiliar. This is the aftershock of jumping timelines. Your consciousness adapts, but not without friction. The integration leaves behind traces, glitches in emotion, tremors in memory, tastes that don't belong to you. You might find yourself craving foods you never liked, picking up hobbies you never considered. You catch yourself saying phrases you've never used, with a cadence that doesn't feel like yours. These aren't quirks, they're echoes, because the version of you that belongs to this timeline was already here, already living. And when you arrived, when your awareness filtered into their body, you inherited more than just their survival. You inherited their preferences, their neural pathways, their scars. It's not possession, it's replacement. A seamless overwrite with a few corrupt files left flickering at the edge of perception. You are still you, but only mostly. Your family doesn't notice the difference. How could they? You remember birthdays, faces, jokes, The differences are too small, too quiet to raise alarms. But you feel it, late at night, in the silence, when something inside whispers, "This isn't right." And it's not just psychological. There's a physical residue too, a hum beneath your skin, a shift in equilibrium. Survivors often report feeling floaty, disconnected, like gravity is misaligned. Some describe a buzzing in their teeth, a high-pitched ring in the ears that isn't quite tinnitus. It's not imagined. It's calibration. When you cross timelines, your consciousness doesn't just reappear. It resonates. It has to settle into new hardware, hardware that is almost, but not exactly, the same. The result is a low-level vibration as two quantum states align. The old you and the new shell syncing. Like audio, slightly out of sync with video. You might feel like an imposter. That's because, in this version of the world, you are. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all. You didn't just survive. You replaced someone. A version of you who was already living here, who never died, who never needed saving. And now they're gone. Their life, their choices, their future, usurped by a refugee from a broken timeline. You carry that weight without knowing it. But deep down, you feel it. Because something in this world always feels a degree off. And that unease, it's the sound of the key not quite fitting the lock. Have you ever wondered why you're still here? Not in the grand philosophical sense, but in the quiet moments when the weight of survival feels like too much. When you've brushed the edge of oblivion so many times that it's no longer frightening, just familiar. When you've lost count of the narrow escapes, when the world feels too strange, too quiet, too tuned to your presence. There may be a reason for that. We call it the observer safety net. In video game design, developers build fail-safes into the system. If the player falls through the map, the game doesn't crash. It resets their position. If they're stuck, the system moves them back into play. The purpose is not realism. It's continuity. The game must go on. Now imagine your life works the same way. Think about all the times you've neared collapse, financial ruin, emotional breakdown, accidents, illness, and yet, just before the breaking point, something intervenes. A solution appears. A phone call comes. A mistake is reversed. It's not always elegant. Sometimes it feels like a cosmic push or an invisible hand on your shoulder. But it happens. Over and over. This isn't luck. It's structural. You are the observer, the player, the first-person point of view. And in this system, whatever this system is, the observer cannot be lost. The narrative must continue, not for your happiness, not for your fulfillment, but because the system requires a lens through which to generate experience. You are that lens. When death approaches, the net deploys. Not because you're special, but because without you, the local instance of reality stops rendering. Observation ceases. And in a simulation or a quantum universe that behaves like one, that's a failure state. So you are rescued. Not always cleanly, not always painlessly, but inevitably. The safety net ensures the story doesn't end. Not yours anyway. You've likely noticed that others don't seem to share your luck. People die. People fall. Sometimes tragically, sometimes senselessly. And you watch, helpless, again and again. This deepens the isolation. Because here lies the darkest implication. The safety net is only for you. Others in your story may not be like you. They may not have the same fail-safes. They might be supporting characters, background code, narrative tools. Their lives may be real. Their pain may be real. but their permanence is not guaranteed. Yours is. As long as you are observing, the system prioritizes you. This is why you wake up when you shouldn't. This is why you survive things others don't. This is why, no matter how many times you spiral toward the void, something always catches you. And with each rescue, you drift a little further from the original timeline. You are still here, but the world around you is not the one you remember. Because each time the net saves you, it has to stitch together a reality where survival makes sense. And those seams are starting to show. You've heard it before. Survivors of disasters, accidents, close calls. They say time slowed down. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. They recall individual raindrops hanging in the air, the rotation of a tire frozen mid-spin, a second stretching into eternity as the car skids, the gun fires, the body falls. Science calls this tachypsychia, a neurological phenomenon triggered by fear and adrenaline. Your brain speeds up, processing more data per second, writing memory in high resolution. It's survival instinct, they say, a feature of evolution. But what if it's more than that? What if it's not your mind speeding up? What if it's reality slowing down? Imagine your consciousness is a complex software running on the universe's hardware. Normally, everything runs smoothly, frames rendering in perfect sequence. But when you approach a critical moment, when death becomes imminent, the system panics. Subject termination detected. That can't happen, not to you, not to the observer. So the system enters emergency mode. Time dilates. Reality buffers. Everything slows because behind the scenes, the engine is doing something extraordinary. It's searching frantically. It's simulating adjacent timelines, rendering countless possibilities, looking for the one viable outcome where you survive. A version of the moment where the bullet misses, the branch doesn't break, the car doesn't flip. This buffering process is what you experience as slow motion. Your mind is temporarily pulled from the driver's seat. You enter observer mode, detached, hyper-aware, waiting, watching. And when the new path is found, when the system locks onto a survivable timeline, it snaps into place. Reality resumes. You come back to yourself with a rush of sound and breath and trembling relief. But you are not the same, because you are not in the same place. You jumped, and the you that hits the ground safely, who stumbles away from the wreck, who wakes up in a hospital room with a second chance, that version of you is a survivor from another thread. You didn't cheat death. You were extracted from its path and dropped into a new one, seamlessly, with only a memory of the fall and a strange sensation in your bones to mark the change. This is why survivors often describe the aftermath in surreal terms. I felt like I was watching myself. Everything looked brighter, sharper, too real. I thought I was dreaming. Because, in a way, you were. Between timelines, between selves. The slow motion was not fear. It was the lag between worlds. The sound of the universe stalling for time to keep you going. Because death, for you, is not an ending. It's a loading screen. Sometimes, the aftermath feels stranger than the moment itself. You're safe, alive, breathing. But everything around you hums with an unfamiliar weight. The colors seem oversaturated. Your body feels borrowed. Gravity tugs at you the wrong way. The air tastes different, and beneath it all, an eerie vibration. Not loud, not painful, but ever-present. A buzz in the teeth, a pressure behind the eyes, a ringing just beyond the edge of hearing. You sit in silence, trying to ground yourself, but the room feels like a movie set, your hands like gloves. The world like something gently misaligned. Clinicians have a name for this: depersonalization. Derealization, a psychological defense mechanism that blurs the edges of reality to protect the mind from trauma. But what if it's not the mind pulling away from the world? What if it's the world pulling away from you? Let's return to quantum physics. When a particle shifts between energy states, a quantum leap, it must absorb or emit energy, a photon, a pulse, a visible consequence of the transition. Nothing crosses the boundary between states without leaving a mark. So what happens when you jump timelines? What happens when your consciousness, the sum of your memory, yourself, leaves one dying version of reality and fuses with a nearly identical version where survival is still possible? Energy must shift. A resonance must occur. That buzz in your body? That's the cost of crossing over. You are syncing with a new host, one that is biologically and chemically similar enough to carry your thread of awareness, but still different in the tiniest of ways. Different enough to feel like déjà vu that won't fade. Different enough to make your favorite food taste slightly wrong. Different enough to make your laugh echo back strangely in your own ears. You've slipped into a parallel vessel, and the hum you feel is the interface, the friction between timelines, the static of two selves rubbing against each other, one fading, one claiming control. And there's more. People who survive these near-death ruptures often report subtle, inexplicable shifts, a change in temperament, a newfound interest, a sudden aversion. They chalk it up to having a new perspective, and perhaps that's true, in a way they don't fully understand, because the version of you in this timeline already existed, and you've overwritten them, inherited their neural wiring, their taste buds, their peculiar rhythms. You are not just continuing, you are continuing in someone else's place. That alien feeling that lingers after survival isn't trauma, it's a merge conflict. You survived because you moved. You escaped because the system found you a body close enough to continue the story. But it was never yours to begin with. You're driving a nearly perfect replica of your old life, but the seat is adjusted wrong, and the mirrors reflect someone you don't quite recognize. And now, no matter how safe you are, some part of you will always be searching for the world you left behind, even if it no longer exists. Survival has a shadow. Each time you cheat death, a thread unravels in the tapestry of your reality. Subtle at first, just enough to make you question your memory, your senses, yourself. But as the jumps accumulate, the dissonance grows louder, and the world grows stranger. You've noticed it, the way your life seems to rearrange itself around you. Patterns shift, people behave oddly. Events that should have spiraled out of control somehow resolve themselves with eerie precision. A check arrives just in time. A missed connection turns into a second chance. A near disaster simply dissipates. We call it luck. But luck, in such concentrated doses, becomes indistinguishable from design. What if these last-minute rescues aren't coincidence? What if they're protocol? In a simulated environment, the player's continuity is paramount. Developers build in invisible mechanisms to ensure the experience doesn't break. If you fall into a place you weren't meant to go, the system repositions you. If you take an action that could end the game prematurely, the rules bend. Now take this logic and apply it to your life. You've teetered at the edge before, emotionally, financially, physically. You've stared into the abyss and felt it, staring back. And just before it swallowed you, something pulled you back. A call, a discovery, a feeling, a pivot. Not because the universe is merciful, because it's structured. You are the point of view character, the observer, and the system will not let you exit while you are still capable of observing. This doesn't mean life is easy. Far from it. The system doesn't care if you're happy. It doesn't care if you suffer. It only cares that you remain in play, that the thread of awareness continues, that data keeps flowing. So it adapts. It compensates for impending collapse with unexpected opportunities. It inserts new variables to maintain momentum. It rewrites the path just enough to keep you upright, eyes open, breath held, and you feel it. You feel the shift, the artificial smoothness of a crisis resolved too cleanly, the sense that something intervened without explanation, the sensation of being nudged, guided, buffered by unseen code. This is the observer's safety net. It only activates when collapse is imminent, when the narrative risks terminal stagnation, when your death or permanent disconnection would crash the local instance. Others don't seem to have this protection. You've seen it. People fall and they don't rise. Their stories end. Their arcs break. And you're left standing, wondering why it wasn't you. Here is the brutal truth. It wasn't allowed to be. Their presence in your story may have been real, but they were not the anchor. You are. Their exits reinforce your narrative. They shape your journey. But they are not safeguarded by it. Only you are. The world bends to keep you here. And the longer it does, the more surreal it becomes. Because reality, like any good system, will use every tool at its disposal to protect its player, even if that means breaking its own rules. There comes a point when the world stops feeling like home. You can't explain it precisely. Everything looks the same: your house, your street, your loved ones' faces. But the texture of reality is off, slightly smoother in places, oddly coarse in others. It's as though someone rebuilt your life from memory and missed a few details. You might find yourself staring at your bookshelf, swearing a title was once spelled differently. You might walk into a store and feel like the layout changed overnight. You ask someone about it. They look at you like you're imagining things. Maybe you are, but the feeling doesn't fade. Instead, it grows. A quiet, persistent hum in the back of your mind. You begin to question what's real, not in the abstract sense, but in the small, specific details of the everyday. The food tastes different, the songs sound off. People seem slightly rewritten. You've crossed too many thresholds. Each jump was designed to be seamless, just enough similarity to maintain continuity. But there's a cost to repeated displacement. Small changes compound, tiny differences stack, and eventually the discrepancies become impossible to ignore. This is timeline drift, the accumulation of anomalies, the long-term side effect of survival. You are alive, yes, but the world you now occupy may be miles removed from the one you once knew, in ways that are invisible to others, in ways that only the observer, you, can detect. And you're not just noticing changes in the environment. You're noticing changes in yourself. Your thoughts have shifted. Your reactions feel foreign. You think about things you never used to or forget things you were once sure of. You walk through a memory and realize it doesn't fit anymore, like trying to wear a coat you outgrew without realizing it. That's not trauma. That's displacement. You've inherited too many near-identical bodies, lived too many nearly matching lives. Now the boundaries are blurred. You are a mosaic of former selves, stitched together by the imperative to continue observing. And still, no one sees it, because to them, you haven't changed. To them, you've been here all along, smiling, breathing, functioning. But you know better. You carry the weight of lifetimes you were never meant to live. You wear the faces of strangers who used to be you, and you can feel the seams of the story stretching, trying to contain the impossible persistence of your awareness. This is not madness. This is consequence. You were never meant to die, but you were never meant to survive this many times either. Now, even the system is starting to strain, and the questions pressing against your skull grow louder. How long can this go on? How many jumps before you lose track of the original? And in the end, if this is no longer the world you began in, and you are no longer the person who began in it, what exactly have you survived for? There's a loneliness that settles in after enough jumps. Not the ordinary kind, the ache of distance, of loss, of longing. This is deeper, quieter. It's the loneliness of knowing that no one around you is really from where you are. Not your original place, not your original time. You begin to feel like a ghost. You walk among people who share your history, your memories, your smiles, but something in their eyes no longer matches. Their timelines didn't break. Yours did. You crossed over. You shifted into a nearly identical reality, but their version of you was never the one who made that leap. They don't know the things you know. They didn't feel the rupture. They didn't die. You did. You've died more than once, in fact, silently, invisibly, and every time you've been reinserted, rebooted, dropped into a world that mirrors the last, but only enough to sustain the illusion. And here's the part no one tells you. There are no footprints left behind, no way to trace where you were, no map to where you're going, just a trail of feelings that don't fit and memories that no longer match. You try to explain it to someone just once. You hint at the shifts, the changes, the sense of dislocation, but they laugh. They nod sympathetically. They tell you everyone feels that way sometimes, but they don't. Not like this. So you stop trying. You become an actor in a play whose script keeps changing. You hit your marks, say your lines, but inside you're drifting. Each night you fall asleep, wondering if tomorrow's world will be just a little different. If the photos in your album will rearrange themselves. If your pet's eyes will be the wrong color. If your reflection will smile half a second too late. You stop trusting your senses, not because they lie, but because they're no longer calibrated to this version of reality. You are a displaced instrument trying to play in tune with an orchestra that doesn't know you're not their original violin. And in this haunting silence, a single truth whispers through the cracks. You are not alone. There are others like you, scattered, waking up with that same hum in their bones, feeling the same pull toward memories that don't quite exist anymore. People who remember the same impossibilities, who feel the same fracture running through their timeline. You may never meet them, but they're out there. Ghosts walking in daylight, sustained by the same safety net, haunted by the same question. If we've died so many times, why are we still being pulled forward? What are we being kept alive for? And who or what is watching us drift from one broken copy of home to the next? By now, you've probably stopped thinking of death as an event. It's not a door that slams shut. It's a ripple, quiet, wide-reaching, barely perceptible if you're not looking for it. For you, death has become a kind of migration, a shift in the wind. A version of the world dims, and another rises in its place, nearly identical, but never exact. And you are carried forward, again and again. You no longer ask, how did I survive? You ask, how many times have I? And the answer is never clear. The system has kept you going, rerouting you through reality's backroads. It finds the cracks between moments and slips you through. You fall, you crash, you collapse, and then you wake up. Dazed, whole, breathing, but changed. Something's been happening in the background. The edges of your experience have grown more elastic, more accommodating. The world has bent itself to fit your continued presence so many times that you can no longer remember where it began to bend at all. And still, it keeps bending. But for how long? Each jump strains the coherence of the simulation. Each rescue leaves residue. Reality gets sloppier. Your sense of continuity grows thinner. The seams show more clearly. The system, it seems, is running out of subtle ways to save you. Soon, it may resort to more desperate ones. A disease that should have killed you mutates into a miracle remission. A plane crash that should have ended in fire is averted by a mechanical quirk no one can explain. A stranger on the street says the exact thing you need to hear, at the exact moment you need to hear it, and then disappears into the crowd. The rescues are no longer quiet. They are declarations. Because the narrative refuses to end. Because you are the observer, the last thread holding this instance of reality together. And if you were to go, the entire fabric would collapse into unused code. You've become the axis around which an improbable world rotates. And maybe, just maybe, it's not about you anymore. Maybe you're being kept alive because your awareness, your data stream, your gaze, is feeding something, generating outcomes, supporting a structure that relies on the illusion of continuity. Perhaps this is no longer about survival. Perhaps it's about containment, about ensuring that your observation doesn't stop. Because when it does, when the screen finally goes dark, what happens to everything built around it? To the characters, to the world, to the simulation that's bent so far to keep you alive? Maybe it ends too, and so the system bends again, even as it groans under the weight of impossibility, even as you drift further from anything resembling home, even as you begin to wonder if there's an end at all, or just more beginnings dressed as miracles, because you are no longer surviving, you are being sustained. So here we are. After all the jumps, the anomalies, the whispers between timelines, what are we left with? A haunting realization. You have died, not once, not metaphorically, but truly, irrevocably, in another strand of reality. You've left behind bodies, funerals, versions of you buried in timelines where your story stopped. And yet, you continue. Each moment you remember as a miracle was not survival. It was migration, a seamless transfer of awareness into a new branch of the world that allowed you to keep observing. You never witnessed your own death, because you can't. Because the story, from your perspective, must go on. We call this quantum immortality. But immortality isn't triumph. It isn't peace. It's a sentence. A compulsion coded deep into the operating system of this existence. The simulation must have a user. The narrative must have a reader. The universe must have an observer. And that observer is you. This isn't meant to terrify. It's meant to illuminate, to pull back the veil, not with conspiracy or fear, but with quiet awe. Because beneath the discomfort, there is a strange grace to it all. You've been carried through an impossible labyrinth, guided not by chance, but by design. You've been chosen not in a mystical sense, but in a structural one. You are necessary, and that necessity is both your salvation and your burden. So what do you do with that knowledge? You could ignore it, push it down, go on living as though the world around you is fixed and whole. Or you could lean in, notice the patterns, honor the moments that shouldn't have happened but did. Listen to the hum when it rises in your bones. Pay attention when the world feels like a set you've seen before, in a dream or a life already lived. And most of all, remember that behind every impossible survival is a fracture in reality, that the déjà vu, the Mandela effects, the uncanny rescues, they are all notes from the cracks in the mirror. That the fear you felt, the slow-motion silence, the sense of being out of place, wasn't madness. It was evidence. You are a signal passing through a sea of probabilities. A thread the system refuses to lose. A presence that bends the story around itself. Not for glory, not for meaning, but because without you, none of this holds together. You are not here by luck. You are here because the universe cannot render without you. And somewhere, in the wake of all the lives you've left behind, in the fading echoes of the people who can no longer follow, there is still this moment, this breath, this version of the world, waiting for what you'll see next.